Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, it's been about a week since the new round of tariffs from Donald Trump have been introduced, and they do have an impact on Canada, and we don't have a deal yet. Should we be worried? Well, that depends on who you ask. Let's backtrack just a little bit and try to get the lay of the land as to where we stand as of now. As we mentioned, there is no trade deal, but there is no lack of advice coming into the Prime Minister from both sides of the border, in fact. It's got to be getting a little irritating. A number of U.S. representatives, of course, go on the Sunday morning talk shows down there and basically say that, we're bad partners, we're nasty people. The president just told us that, and his ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, has mentioned the same thing. The nasty Canadians just don't want to cooperate. Well, that's their storyline, but it's not really the way things are going here. And they're saying that's one of the reasons why, for instance, we didn't get an exemption last week, and Mexico did, because they're nicer people. And they play ball. In other words, they didn't retaliate with their own set of tariffs, and they just seem to be sitting there waiting and rolling over and not saying a whole lot against the Trump administration. And I guess that impressed the president. We, on the other hand, are standing our ground, which is what we want them to do. That's what we want the Prime Minister to do. That's what we want our trade representatives to do. And as for some of the advice from south of the border, thanks, but no thanks, okay? We don't need your help. As a matter of fact, the BS that you guys are spreading out there is really only making matters worse. Hoekstra was one of them, of course. He's the one that mentioned just the other day that when he was talking about these new tariffs, he says, look, when you get right down to it, he says, Canada didn't really get hit that hard by these new tariffs. Well, yeah, it does have an impact on us. And I grant you, there is, when you look at some of the statistics here, a lot of the stuff that we still do with the United States vis-a-vis trade is covered by the existing North American Free Trade Act, the CUMSA deal. And about 85 to 90%, depending on which study you look at, says that those goods can still go back and forth tariff-free. Well, that's good news, but there is still a number of goods, and it's not just the 15 or so percent that don't exist under that umbrella, but there's the major industries that we're talking about here that still have not been addressed: steel, aluminum, dairy, softwood lumber, and on, that are under very severe tariffs, and not a whole lot is being done about it. Not a whole lot is being acknowledged by the American side. And they're saying, well, you should get back to the table and try to find a deal. And again, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I even hate to use that word deal, because what Trump is doing with his other partners here, whether it's the EU, the UK, whatever the case might be, these are not trade deals. These are a list of demands that people like Prime Minister Carney in the UK, or Sheinbaum in Mexico for that matter, or Ursula von der Leyen from the European Union have simply said, yeah, sure, that's great. There's no paper, there's no list of how this is going to work out, who's going to do what. You just get Trump rambling on there and saying, yeah, they're going to invest billions of dollars into the United States economy, and we're going to put their stuff in there tariff-free. And even the EU president said, no, that's not what we talked about, and that's not what we agreed to. So, when push comes to shove and they start getting into some of the fine points of this, you're going to see a lot of these so-called deals that Trump is touting are just going to blow up, because they were never really substantive to begin with, which is another reason why we in Canada should be proud of the fact that we're not going to fall for that trick. We want to get a decent trade deal. But before we do that, and before we get back to the bargaining table, a couple of things. First of all, like I say, the BS that's coming from people like Ludnick and some of the other people here is really harmful. I know they're trying to create their own narrative down in the States, and most people who don't do a whole lot of research simply say, well, that's it. I guess the Canadians are really screwing us around. One thing I would like to do, I've got a couple of things I'd like to see the United States delegation consider, or in fact do. Maybe it's about time that we started putting some parameters into these negotiations too. First and foremost, please stop linking this idiotic tariff policy from Donald Trump to the idea that there's a fentanyl crisis at the Canadian-U.S. border. There isn't. Yes, there is some stuff that costs, but as we've talked about, and as the United States' own numbers have verified, 0.9% of the stuff that crosses into the United States is coming from Mexico, not from Canada. So this stuff that he's retaliating about because we're not doing anything about fentanyl is just a load of crap. First of all, we are doing a lot in our own border security, and we have substantively reduced even that 1% that was going across the border. So we're working on it. So, President Trump, just back off and quit shooting the BS about stuff that's just simply not true. The other element to this, too, is when it comes to, do this or do that, rescind that law, or we're not even going to sit down at the bargaining table, which is something that I think bothers an awful lot of Canadians. It bothers me when I see those sorts of things, too. But in a true negotiation, when there's a back and forth, a quid pro quo, as it were, put something else on the table. For instance, now, as we do this podcast, there's a number of Republicans are now calling for Canada to basically rescind the Online Streaming Act. Now, that's something that's been in place here for 2 or 3 years, controversial piece of legislation. And they simply say, well, it's harmful to American businesses. I'm not so sure that's the case, but that's, the story that they're spouting. And they want the Canadian government to just basically blow that whole piece of legislation up and rescind it. And they're pressuring the Trump administration, who would love nothing more than to simply tell us how to do our business up here, to pressure us to get rid of the legislation. Well, I got a different point of view on that. If you want to put that out there as a negotiating point, in other words, let's talk about Canada's Online Streaming Act. Put something else. Counter that. Say, you do that for us, and here's what we'll do for you, like lower steel tariffs, for instance, or any number of other things that they could do. That's what negotiation is. This is not a negotiation, though. That's how you get things done. Yes, you give up something that you maybe didn't want to, but you're getting something in return that could be just as beneficial, if not more beneficial. But the United States and Trump are not working that way. And not just with Canada, but if you've noticed these deals that he's announcing with all these other entities, all these other parts of the world, there is in no way at any time any talk or indication of something the United States is putting on the table. It's just demand, 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 demand. So these are not negotiations in any way, shape, or form. It's the thing that I think is finding an awful lot, the Canadians rather, are finding very frustrating. And I know certainly the Prime Minister is feeling it, and I'm certain Dominic LeBlanc and the negotiating team are feeling it too. But in the spirit of trying to find a deal, tell us what you're willing to put on the table. What are you going to do for this? You want to blow up our supply management. And they say, oh, no, we don't. We just want to have our American dairy farmers to have full access to the Canadian market. No, that's not going to happen. It was negotiated in the past 2 U.S.-Canadian trade deals. And for Trump to get out there as he does and say, well, Canada's really being mean to American farmers. No, they're not. There are quotas that have been established and agreed upon by both sides, including, by the way, the Trump administration. They're the ones that negotiated this deal. And these 200 to 400% tariffs that Trump is talking about that we're imposing on American farmers is a load of crap. It's not the case at all. There are penalty clauses if they exceed the amount of stuff that they're supposed to be sending across the border, but every contract has that. It's like a penalty clause. If you're not going to get fined $500 for driving down Main Street in your town, but if you're driving down 45 kilometers over the speed limit, yes, there is consequence and there's a penalty. Same thing with this. That's a penalty that's in place, but it hasn't even been imposed on anybody because the Americans aren't coming anywhere near close to it. So again, another falsehood that Trump and his team are parlaying here that's really muddying the waters. So stop the crap and let's have an honest negotiation about what's going back and forth here. And I know Trump wants to be the winner in all of this stuff, but it's very, very frustrating to find some sort of a deal. Now, what's even more frustrating is some of the voices, the nattering voices that we're getting on this side of the border. Pierre Poilievre, who seems to have found his voice now after some of the negative press that he's received. He's busy with his by-election now, out, of course, in Alberta. But he's, again, starting to criticize the government and saying, there should be pipelines. They're going to be, if he were the prime minister, he said he'd have shovels in the ground for 2 of these pipelines by March of next year. Well, thank God Poilievre is not the prime minister. And it's a ridiculous assertion that he could get something done that quickly. There is a process that has to be followed. There's different negotiations and conversations that have to be held with Indigenous folks, and a number of other things that have to be done. And even though the Carney government has passed the legislation to fast-track this, that doesn't mean they're just going to put shovels in the ground and let's deal with the consequences later. That's not happening. But Poilievre just is so unrealistic when it comes to stuff like this. But the other part of it is coming from kind of a voice from the past, I guess. His name is Ed Fast. Now, Ed Fast, just to give you a little rundown on who the players are in this situation. Ed Fast is a former minister in the Stephen Harper government. He was the Minister of International Trade. I think he had some other portfolios too, but that is the one I think that is probably applicable here because we're talking about international trade, right? And he has released a paper that was done in concert with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a kind of a think tank that basically they describe themselves as a nonpartisan group. Of course, all these groups think they're nonpartisan, or at least want us to believe that they're nonpartisan. The reality is the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a right-leaning, sort of business-oriented institution, and that's fine. Free country, difference of opinions, that's great. Have them all in here, but just understand where they're coming from when they write policy papers like this. Just like the Center for Policy Alternatives that we've talked about from time to time is more of a left-leaning organization. So you're going to get that perspective, and that's good. It's healthy to have those voices. But anyway, they've released what they call their paper, and it's titled The Grand Bargain. Now, it's long and detailed, and I don't want to get into all the minutiae of this, but the essence of it seems to be, from my read on this, is what they're encouraging Prime Minister Carney to do is drop the counter-tariffs, okay? Forget about that, because all you're doing is irritating Trump, and we don't want to irritate Donald Trump, and basically get everybody together around the table and put everything on the table, everything, the things that you're angry about, the things that you want an agreement on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and just hash them out. Well, we've been doing that. I really don't understand their rationale behind this, but as if to say that the Americans are all of a sudden, after the way that they've been treating us and other nations over the last, couple of months now in this trade deal, but just as much in the last trade deal in the last Trump administration, you don't think they're going to have this revelation say, you know what, we've been unfair to you. We really do apologize. Let's cut a deal now that's going to be fair. That's not going to happen. We're dealing with Donald Trump here, one of the most irrational human beings on this earth, and he's not going to give us that sort of a deal. So to suggest that if we play ball or do whatever they want, that they're going to give us something in return is such a naive approach to this, not unlike what Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan was talking about, and we mentioned that in a previous podcast. Drop all the counter-tariffs, and the Americans will come to the table and maybe be more reasonable. I think the analogy I used was if you're in a boxing match and you drop your gloves, don't expect the opponent to stop punching you. They're going to punch you more. And that's Trump's attitude on this, too. There has to be somebody who's going to stand up for our principles and for our best interests at the same time. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to suggest that if we simply acquiesce, that the Americans are going to come and say, okay, what can we do for you? You're never going to hear that from Donald Trump. And you're certainly never going to hear that from the negotiating team because they simply parrot everything that Donald Trump says. So the whole idea here about a grand bargain that can be struck from this, and it's just, as I say, sounds naive. And I see where Ed Fast is coming from because, he had some negotiations and some experience in negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership and some of the other deals that were being discussed during the Harper administration. And I get that. That was then, and this is now. And I think that's something that we have to get our heads around. And certainly the conservatives, and for that matter, I guess the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, get your heads around this too. This is not the way things used to be. And I know Prime Minister Carney has talked about that time and time again. Well, start to put that in perspective, okay? Don't expect fairness. Don't expect that there's going to be some reciprocal agreement here. It's not going to happen with Trump, all right? It's take without giving anything. Now, he wants us to rescind, well, he already did, of course, and we did the digital service tax. Now they're talking about the Online Streaming Act. He wants us to basically gut the supply management deal, which is going to have an impact on farmers. Higher tariffs for steel. He doesn't want an auto industry in this country. Like, this is where this guy's coming from. And those are his positions. And all of the people sitting around that table or sitting in the Congress are simply going to echo that. And so let's understand what we're up against here, okay? That this grand idea that everybody's going to sit at the table and everything's going to be fine is pie in the sky, and we can't afford that now. We're hurting, and a lot of other countries are hurting, and the Americans are hurting. They don't want to admit it, and the Trump administration, of course, is doing what they can to try to stop that message. They got some statistics out just a few days ago that said that a lot of his policies are really tanking and having a negative effect on employment. But they fired the person that wrote the report. That doesn't change the reality. So here's what we're dealing with. So I'm not suggesting, hey, let's just stay the course, or hey, let's just, fold our arms and go home, but we're not going to play with you. We have to find some sort of a deal. but we also have to protect our own interests and the interests of those that are around us. That's the representation that we expect. That's the duty of the people that we elect in Ottawa and in the provinces to make sure that they stand up for Canada. And let's continue to do that. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Catch us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, by the way, don't forget to hit the notification bell so you can share. Check the podcast description, too, for further reading material. And please, I want to ask you a favor. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I mean, your loyalty to the podcast is greatly appreciated. It's fabulous to see more and more people coming on side with every one of the podcasts. But by subscribing, well, you help the podcast grow, and you can support the work that we're doing here, too. And we really appreciate your support that way, too. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.